Hello and welcome. My name is Yves Sandfort. I'm going to walk you through a distributed enterprise installation of VMware vRealize 7.0. I'm VCDX number 203 and also CEO of the comdivision group. If you want to reach out to me, feel free to do so on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @YvesSandfort, or drop me an email at y.sandfort@comdivision.com. Thank you. And let's get started. When we look at a VRA 7 installation, we want to go through it by using the assistant. In our case, I have already pre-deployed 2 appliances, so the VRA appliances. I also deployed 2 IAAS boxes, so Windows 2012 boxes. There is not really a lot built or done on them. I have 2 boxes as DEM workers and orchestrators. And I have 1 box which is going to be our SQL server. Should we at a later point in time require a cluster for that, we can do so as well. So to get started, log into your first VRA appliance. One note, if you are using a load balancer, it should only allow access to the first instance of each individual machine. So first instance of appliance, first instance of IAAS, first instance of DEM. It's going to tell you when you are going to switch that. So the big news in VRA 7 is that new wonderful assisted installer. So you have this wizard now. And I showed you in the previous video on how to do a simple install. Today we are going to do a distributed enterprise installation. This is going to help us build on components which are redundant, so in case an individual appliance would fail or something like that. So once the first stage is over, or the welcome screens and license agreements, etc., we need to deploy the VRA Management Agent onto each individual box. I'm going to show you that on one specific box to keep it easy. For that, I'm going to log into that box. In our case, I used already the services account. And then you open basically a browser, and within the browser you are going to quickly access the individual VRA homepage. So that's https:// your VRA FQDN /installer/VCAC-IAAS Management Agent .exe or .msi. You can find the link on the assistant homepage. Once you get there, you need to confirm that you trust the certificate, because so far we haven't done anything about the certificates yet. We're not going to do in this video anyway, because I want to be sure we get this started. Yes, we trust ourselves. Then you hit next on the Management Agent installer. You confirm that you have read and understood the license agreement. You tell it where to install. And the next thing is that you now need to actually explain how to find the link back to the VRA system. I'm going to use my load balancer address, so it's https://vra.geger.cdip.net:5480. The root credentials. And then I'm going to load the thumbprint. And hang on a second. Oh, yeah. Should not only talk about :5480, but also edit at the end. Hit load again, and here we get the thumbprint, and for sure you would actually validate that it's the correct thumbprint. Then you hit next, and now you need to tell it what's the service account for the Windows box. It's always encouraged to use a real services account for that, like I do in my example here. Then let's wait for this agent to be completed. And once that is actually done and completed, we can go back to the VRA assistant. I'm going to do the exact same procedure on all the other boxes. So this needs to be done on the IAAS boxes as well as on the DEM boxes. Brave Citizen logging out. And once that is completed, you should actually move on. Then you get to the VRA appliance. You tell it what is the secondary appliance, provided with the credentials to log into that secondary appliance. And then the next step is that you are going to define which server gets which role. So Again, this is a pretty straightforward process. You can basically just define which of your identified VMs does which role. There can be only one primary web service with Model Manager data. Every other web is going to be spread across. You define where the DEM workers should go and where the agents should be placed. So should you have more systems, you could even spread that across all these individual systems. So again, this wizard is actually quite good because it allows you to validate a lot of rules and changes. However, there are a few things which you need to be aware. For example, there are certain characters which are not working good with the user account manager. So, for example, passwords which include equal signs. There are some issues, obviously, with commas. And it seems for me as if I have found an issue where a number at the beginning actually causes issues as well. So once these server roles have been defined, you can actually run a prerequisite checker. And this is much better than it was in the older versions before, because now the prerequisite checker then allows you to also do the validation, not only the validations, but also do the fixes. So let's give this a run and wait for it to be finished. So it's going to go through each individual box and then present us with what's actually missing on each individual box. So as we can see, there are a few things which didn't work. So you can hit the fix button, which is going to try to attempt to solve the individual boxes. My experience has shown that this works perfectly well for the DEMs, so for the distributed execution managers, but the IAAS boxes, it seemed to miss one component. So you will see here that it will come back and actually say that the DEM workers are both okay, but then it will start to tell us that the IAAS boxes are faulty. The reason for that is, even though I actually inserted the ISO image of the Windows 2012 R2 server, it seemed to be unable to get the proper corrections on the individual components correctly. So we will have to jump into that later. But before you do that, be aware that at the end of this process, it's going to restart the individual VMs, no matter what you do anyway. So we need to wait for this to actually come back to us and tell us that the status is failed. Then you will see that it's going to reboot the individual boxes. And once we see that the individual boxes have been rebooted, you can actually log into these individual boxes and start to provide the fix. I'm going to show you real quickly what were the components which were missing in my case, because I guess in most cases that's going to be similar what you see in your environments, because these are standard Windows 2012 R2 boxes, nothing really fancy set up, nothing specially made or done, just standard normal procedures. So once the box is actually back up and running, I'm going to open the console to it, and actually then I'm going to go through the process of resetting the basic configuration. Again, it's not really rocket science. You only need to know which components are missing. So I'm going to quickly log into the box here and fix what has been missing. For that, go open the server manager. And then within the service manager, go to Manage, Add Remove Features. Again, straightforward. Most of it has been set up already, so this is going to be much easier for us now. Scroll down to the web server, unfold the web server. Within the web server, unfold the web server below it, and then there is a point which is called Application Development. Unfold that, and we need the ASP.NET 3.5, which will automatically say it's going to add the .NET Framework 3.5 as well. That's it for the roles, and we are going to do something similar for the features. So hit the next button, and down here we need to enable a few WCF features. I'm not 100% sure if I need them, but without them I had some issues, so I'm going to add them in, and the same for the .NET 3.5. We need some additional features here as well, which will automatically also activate the process activation, which we are going to go now for next. So let's look into the process activation. You can see that it has now selected all of them. Hit the next button. Again, the reason why we are doing this is because it couldn't pick the files from the original install, so I'm going to manually show it the sources path now. Hit OK, hit install, and we are almost ready to go. The install process by itself just takes a couple of seconds, and once that is done on this box, I'm going to do the same on the other box, but we will skip that in this video because it's just redundant to what you just saw. So the .NET 3.5 needs to be added to the web server, and you need to be sure that the process activation framework is properly set up and enabled. You will find also all these informations in the show details from the error page. So let's go back. Let's run another check. And this time we would hope that all systems will come back with the information green. And then we can move along. So again, the prerequisite checker has improved quite a bit from 6.2. It is actually able to fix a lot more things than it was in the past. You can really, in most cases, showcase it a Windows 2012 box, and it's going to be able to do most of the installation by itself. There are some pieces, like what I just saw, what I just showed you, which were missing. But this might be, if I were to just actually provide a corporate install URL or something like that, then maybe 2012 will actually get around this much more easier and much more smooth. So, as we can see, everything is up to green and OK. So we can actually move along and go to the next step of our distributed VRA installation. So far you can see it's pretty straightforward, pretty easy, and compared to what you had to go through with version 6.2, where this was really a lengthy process, it really, even for the distributed install, is improved. This is where we pointed to the load balancer address. So in our case, we are going to add vra.gear.cdip.net, which is basically our address for our external address for our load balancer. If this is a publicly facing address, you should include that here. This is basically what VRA will also point the load balancing address, not the load balancing, the certificate address for. So be sure that you set up something which actually works. Next, we need to define an administrator account for the single sign-on. So as you might have figured, the VRA 7 does no longer use the vSphere SSO. It now uses the VMware provided identity manager, which comes from the Horizon Suite. And for that, we are going to define an administrator account here. The advantage with this is we are no longer messing in the SSO database, so VRA becomes much more independent from our vSphere installation. So I'm going to provide the password here. You see also all the rules which need to be applied. You hit next. Again, this is now step-by-step going through all the individual components. Next, we need to identify what's going to be the public or official, in our case, load balanced IAAS and manager services address. Again, this is a pretty straightforward process, just point it to the fully qualified domain names, and actually you also need to provide, like with the older versions of VRA, a security passphrase which is used for all the encryption of other data within the system. If you ever need to actually unencrypt something, you need this passphrase. If you lose it, you are lost, basically. Then you could reset all passwords and everything to 0, but there is nothing else you can do. I mean, you could do number crunching, but that doesn't point out. Didn't I just say fully qualified domain name? You should not actually include the URL poster. So just remove the https:// just the host name, and we are good to go. Next is our SQL server. So pointed to the Microsoft SQL server we are going to use. In our case, we are also going to use Windows authentication, much more straightforward, and in reality, actually giving us a much simpler approach to maintain the environment and maintain security. Good. Click validate and then hit next. And then for the web role, again, it's going to actually ask us a few things like what's the website name, etc. Again, also, we need to provide the user account credentials, what this service should be running under. Again, this is my service account I'm going to use for all the IAAS components. You could separate some of them, but then you need to be really sure that you understand what has been done. Okay, hit validate. This is going to actually really connect to the box and check that all of this can be set up and make sense. Validation takes a few seconds, and then you can actually move along. And then we are going to define the individual parameters and configurations for the manager service. So we need to define which box this is going to be. There is always only going to be one active box. So as you can see, by the point in time, you are going to click one, it's going to automatically disable the other one. However, the password information and user account information needs to be provided for both boxes, otherwise you're getting yourself into trouble. Good. Again, let's validate that these settings all make sense and work in the system. This shouldn't, again, take too long. It's just quick connection to the Windows boxes and validating that everything works. So now we have defined most of our IAAS services. Next, we come to the distributed execution managers, or DEMs. So we need to give them a name. That's how they are going to be shown in the logs and everywhere in our VRA system later on. And we also need to provide user accounts and passwords for the services to run under. And again, I'm going to stick with the same account information across all my individual systems, but it might be required that depending on what you are actually using in your environment, that you actually have different user account for the individual use cases. Also be careful in reviewing the reference architecture. Carl Prahl, a friend of mine, actually wrote quite a bit of it. There are new information in regards to when you should actually place DEM workers externally and when they should be internally. So be sure that you really validate what's in there and what's supported before you actually go ahead and do something here. Good. Again, quick validation. Once that is completed, we can actually move along, go to the agents. Agents are used to connect between the DEM and the actual infrastructure. In our case, we are going to have vSphere agents. Notice here that depending on whether you want to use an HA mode or distributed mode, you should actually give them the same name. In our case, we want to have them as a redundancy. So we are going to call the individual agents on both systems exactly the same way. So they will have will be called vSphere Cloud, and that's the same for the agent name and the endpoint name later on. And we will use again our services account for the IAAS services, just to keep it a bit straightforward and easy and simple, so that we don't have too many accounts to mess around with. Be sure that you set up that account also in a way that it doesn't actually expire the password, because as you can see here, it's a lot of individual services and components which are using these. And if you ever make a change to this, there needs to be a clear procedure in place to go step by step into each individual system and validate that all that works. Again, once this is completed, we are going to validate this, that all of this works and makes sense. It's not really that complicated as you have seen so far. It's much more straightforward to do this in VRA 7. So Once the validation is completed, we are going to move along to the next segment, which is certificates. For some internal reasons, I'm going to not actually provide specific certificates in this deployment. I'm going to potentially create another video later on how to replace certificates. In our case, we are going to stick with self-assigned certificates for the beginning. So to get moving with this, we hit the next button and actually get started on that. So again, certificates play a very important role within VRA. Be sure that you really understand what you get yourself into. In our case, again, we are going to use the self-signed, self-generated certificates for the moment. I'm going to replace them later. So you're provided with the organization, the organizational unit, and a country code. Everything else is done by the system. Hit the save button, which will generate the certificate, and then it's a bit weird from a usability perspective, but then it's going to show you the certificate, and then you are just going to hit next and stick with this individual certificate. So let's give it a second to complete. So as you can see, it has generated the certificate. It's valid for 5 years. That should be good enough for the moment. And then we hit next and do a similar procedure on the web server itself again. So we are going to generate a certificate, provide org unit, country code, etc., and create the certificate for this specific IAAS use case, which is for our Windows boxes the same way. You could, in theory, also separate the manager service, but as we are keeping it on the same box, we are going to reuse the same certificate for the web server for that as well. So for the manager service again, so next, manager service, you will see that the certificate information is pre-populated. As said, this is due to the fact that we already have all the information in the system. And here you get all the information for the load balancers. Again, they should not be activated at this point in time. You should only point the load balancers to the first instance of everything. And the next stage is now that we are going to run through final validation. This is going a bit deeper than all the individual validations we have seen before. So this step-by-step validates all the individual machines. If certificates can be applied, user accounts are there, communication channels can be established, whether all the information we enter makes sense. And this is really where VMware has spent a lot of time, and I guess for upcoming versions will spend even more time to ensure that whatever actually gets created gets validated, gets entered here. So as you can see, all green, all succeeded check marks for us here. So we are basically good to go. The next stage is that the system warns you that you should really have the final stage where you should create snapshots. We have done that now, so all 7 systems, both appliances, IAAS, DEM workers, and Microsoft SQL servers, we created snapshots on each one of them. I would actually suggest that you do snapshots even before the first step, but that's up to you. It at least saved me in one specific situation already. Okay, and now we get to the installation details. The system tells us, okay, this is going to take between 30 minutes and an hour or 2. To be realistic, 30 minutes is very, very optimistic. I've seen rather scenarios of 1 to 3 hours, depending also on the number of machines you are going to go and deploy. So you can now see that it step by step goes through this individual process. So we start off with the identity manager, ensuring that all that gets set up, then it's creating the databases. The lucky part is those of you who have been through the 6.2 releases before, they know how many manual steps were actually necessary until here. So it's going to set up clustered single sign-on, it's going to set up the Postgres database in a way that can be clustered. It's now in the next step going to validate that all the services were running. Remember from the old versions where you had to manually check specific services. It's then going to deploy the certificate on all the individual components, and in the next stage it's going to roll out the individual database. So you can follow the system step by step along how it's going to manually proceed all these. So after the database we are going to proceed with the IAAS boxes and create the DEM orchestrators, and then the system is going to move along with the DEM workers. As you can see here, the system in stage 1 actually creates everything on the node 1, which is basically completed when you see that it actually tries to join the appliance to the system. So now the secondary appliance, database cluster, etc. is set up. And in the next phase, it's going to add all the other individual components and basically clone the configuration for the secondary IAAS boxes and make those available. Overall, if everything goes well, it's a pretty straightforward process. One of the next stages is now that we have to enter the license key information. For sure, I'm not going to show you exactly which license key I'm going to enter here. Be aware that there are new license keys for VRA 7 and that you can either use standalone VRA license keys or vCloud Suite license keys. They might have different functionalities depending on the suite level you are in or the license level you are provisioning. So vCloud Suite goes via CPU licenses, whereas the standalone licenses still go with the OSI model, so installed instances. So you could enable the CIP program. We are going to keep it disabled because, oh no, let's keep it enabled. I'm so undecided. Hit next. This would basically feed information back to VMware about the usage of the system. So this step is actually quite interesting. VRA 7 uses an automated process to deploy configuration, which is actually a VRO workflow. So you are going to give it the information for a specific admin user account, which is now going to create and use the content workflow to set up the initial structure in the system. It's a bit the eat your own dog food scenario, and I really like the approach that instead of writing hard-coded install and configuration procedures, they are going to use orchestrator workflows more and more to proceed and build specific data. Again, pretty straightforward. Hopefully the process runs through and everything is correctly set up. So now that all these components have been created, you will see that the system also tells us that we should finally configure our load balancers. It also has the load balancer parameters in here. There is actually also a PDF document which I would suggest you look for. That's it. VRA is now set up for distributed enterprise use. I hope you enjoyed this rather long video this time, but it's a lot of steps. My name is Yves Sandfort, VCDX for Cloud and Management. I'm also the CEO of the comdivision group. And if you want to reach out to me, you can find me on Twitter at Yves Sandfort is my Twitter handle, or write me an email at y.sandfort@comdivision.com. Thank you, and see you and hear you next.